Okay, welcome back to the final part of forensic psychology, where we are talking about offending behaviour and how we deal with it. So we have already spoke about custodial sentencing, using prisons as a method of controlling and trying to stop our offending behaviour. We've also spoke about behaviour modification, so using token economy systems, using the premise of operant conditioning to try and manage our offenders in a prison setting. So today we're talking about anger management and whether or not it's an effective tool for offending behaviour. So the last two parts of this are kind of focused a lot more on rehabilitation. So if we can put in place skills, programs, this might help our offenders stop offending, bring down our recidivism rates, and hopefully act as a positive behaviour management tool to get offenders back into society. So firstly, what is anger management? So anger management is essentially a cognitive approach to look at the way an offender thinks and challenge their perception of reality and perception of their own ways of thinking and emotions. So Novico suggests that some offences occur because offenders can't effectively deal with their anger. They might have antisocial tendencies, which are then displaced onto inappropriate targets. They might not know how to regulate their emotions. And instead of talking and communicating, their way of dealing with this behaviour is to lash out and potentially be violent. So bringing in this treatment is trying to challenge the way an offender thinks. How can we rationalise? How can we focus on changing a negative behaviour into a positive? So as it's a cognitive behavioural technique, it's very much based on CBT. There's a few stages that anger management goes through in order to get to the end goal. So the first is the cognitive preparation stage, probably the hardest, where offenders have to reflect on past experiences and learn to identify those situations that trigger anger. So it's all about being reflective in the first stage. Second are skills that they develop. So working with a psychologist, they will be given cognitive, behavioural and physiological skills to help manage their behaviour. So it might be in terms of the cognitive stage, positive self-talk to encourage calmness. So that essentially means like challenging your emotions. So if you change your mindset from negative to positive and you're thinking, okay, actually glass half full rather than glass half empty, if you're already in a better frame of mind and a positive mood, you might be less likely to commit offences. Behavioural requires looking at how offenders communicate. So rather than it being automatic anger, this has annoyed me, straight to violence, taking a step back, they might even say to them, count down from 10 before you do anything. So if you're already annoyed, try counting down, a deep breath. It's really calming. Nice deep breath. Taking that time to pause before you then carry out the behaviour. Then physiological, so the physical reaction to anger could be the aftermath. So if I'm angry, I've had that behavioural technique where I've taken a step back before I've committed any, before I've gone through with a behaviour. The physiological side is, okay, a bit of meditation, relaxation training, breath management, all of these things to stop the anger from manifesting in the first place. So giving them skills to try and alleviate the anger. And then lastly is your opportunity to practice, which sounds crazy. You give an offender some role play where the prison officer, or actually we're not prison officer, somebody who they are working with, maybe probably the psychologist, will be someone who's trying to rile up this offender, and then they have to show that they have the skills to then minimize that situation. So that just, I would not want to be the person that's riling up a murderer. You know, oi Baldy. That's just not what you're gonna that's just not what you're gonna do. But having that time to practice and applying some skills could be beneficial. Not true to life though. So ultimately, these three things are how we're going to teach the offenders to be better people, reflect on their behaviour. Excuse me, sorry. You've got Mad Terry here. Bit of AO2 to have a practice. Using the stages of anger management. Refer it to Terry. Using evidence. How likely is it that Terry will be able to control his anger in the future? So good bit of AO2 practice. Then an acronym to help you remember the stages of anger management. Calm people should avoid angry people. I'm sure you can think of something much ruder, but I think that's a good way of remembering. Okay, so we've got some AO1 here, which we can also use for AO2. So a really big study done in 2004 by Jane Ireland, looking at the effectiveness of anger management programs with young male offenders. So hopefully as you're reading this, you're picking out some of the issues with the research. So we've got a natural experiment already. There are pros and cons to using a natural experiment. Excuse me. Pros being that we have an we have an IV that's naturally occurring, but lots of extraneous variables that we're going to come across. We've got 15 male prisoners, gender bias, okay sample, with a control group, great comparison. Those who are not on an anger management course, both were then given a cognitive behaviour interview, a checklist completed by the prison officers. Interesting. Looking at 29 angry behaviours. So we've got our prison officers who are completing this on behalf of the prisoners for, giving them scores of 0, 1 or 2 for the week before the interview. And then the prisoners doing a self-report, talking about their anger, how their anger has increased or decreased. So after the treatment, the prisoners who completed calm, so that's the experimental group, rated themselves lower on the anger questionnaire and were rated lower on aggression by prison officers. Interesting how both of those things correlate. No reduction in either of these measures in the control group. 92% of the treatment group, improvements on at least one measure. 48 on both, 8% showed none. So, interestingly here, looking at the results, we're saying that this anger management program has shown has shown effects, but we've already got gender bias, we've got a comparison group, that's great. Natural experiment, issues with variables, extraneous variables, and we're not sure if this is going to have a long-term effect, along with the fact we've got prison officers rating their anger, and also the prisoners themselves. So we've got self-report. And I know that if I was in prison and I was offered this, most likely you would act up because you think, oh, maybe it's going to reduce my sentence, or maybe I'll get a reward for saying that it's working. So evidence for AO1, but also use it for evaluation. Okay, so we've done this already, but it could be useful to have in your notes a little bit of extra AO3. Okay, so more AO1 again, we can flip it into AO3 as well. Keene, 2000. Progress made by young offenders aged 17 to 21 who took part in the National Anger Management Package. So this was an initiative run by UK prisons to see if we used anger management, could it be beneficial to offenders, stop recidivism, and lower the prison population. So they received 8 2-hour sessions, issues of them not taking it seriously. As you can imagine, 17 to 21-year-olds who are, in this case, male offenders, maybe they just see it as, I don't know, an easy gimmick. It's not really going to have any real impact on them. But they did see positive outcomes. So increased capacity to exercise self-control. Is that due to the program though, or is that due to them growing up? I mean, it's hard to tell. So when we're talking about effectiveness of research, it's kind of hard to say if it's definitely due to the program. So it's better than behaviour modification. It outlasts those effects of behaviour modification. It looks at the causes of offending, which is the cognitive processes that trigger anger. And so it's potentially more applicable in the real world and lead to a permanent change. But follow-up studies tend to not support this assumption. Blackburn finding out that it may have an effect in the short term, but actually there's little evidence that it stops reoffending. Because when you're in the real world, there are different triggers and different situations than you would have come across in the role play setting with a trained psychologist. So it might not be that effective at reducing recidivism. In terms of individual differences, it depends, the success depends on the person. Participation in anger management had little overall impact when compared to a control group. It's not true for all the offenders, so it's hard to measure progress. It's hard to generalize that anger management is 100% effective, because you potentially a certain profile, those who have committed certain crimes, it's not going to potentially work for murderers or rapists, but it might work for somebody who has committed GBH, where that's completely it works for some crimes, but not others, essentially. And it's pricey. To get people trained, they have to be specialists, they have to be willing to deal with violent offenders. Many prisons, they're not going to have the resources to fund it. They need to have more staff to run it. It takes time, and therefore it doesn't work in most prisons. And if it's not necessarily applied to all prisons, it's hard to know if it's actually going to have any impact. So if it's implemented, it's probably going to be implemented in the richer parts of the country compared to the poorer parts. So we might see less reoffending, for example, in lovely Kensington, but we'll probably see more offending in inner city Hull, as an example. So research methods. Research methods is for you to have a look at then. So we've got a bit of AO2, how they're randomly allocated, and some ethical issues with the answers on the next slide.